Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that, but it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolong Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolong is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLONLIFE.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors.
Hello, everyone. Before we get started today, we want to tell you about the latest true crime podcast that we have been binging, Morning Cup of Murder.
You remember those desktop calendars that would tell you about what happened on that day in history? Well, Morning Cup of Murder took that idea and turned it into a daily podcast that now has over 750 episodes that dive into serial killers, cults, cold cases, murders, and more.
And Morning Cup of Murder is perfect if you don't have a lot of time to dive into a podcast. It is the best way to start your day because each episode is less than 10 minutes long. So it is perfect to listen to while having that first cup of coffee or tea in the morning.
Morning Cup of Murder can be heard everywhere you listen to podcasts. Check out Morning Cup of Murder today.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, we conclude our investigation into the Evansdale murders. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my motherly co-host, Alice.
Hi, Brett. This makes sense now because Mother's Day just passed, but for everyone else, they might be a little confused why
That's
you
true.
said
When
that.
you're listening to this in 2 weeks, remember, we are recording this right after Mother's Day.
Right after Mother's Day.
Allison suggested that, Alice. Everybody wished you a happy Mother's Day on the Twitter, so I hope you got all those messages.
Thank you. That was very sweet of you guys. And don't worry, for all those fans looking out for Mrs. Brett, I immediately wished her a happy Mother's Day.
I wished her a happy Mother's Day as well, just not on Twitter. So, but I appreciate people looking out for her. That's
yes,
good.
Yes. Thanks. Thank you guys looking out for Mrs. Brett.
It's important. It's important. Trust me. Very important. Well, guys, we're back today talking about the Evansdale murders. Those of you who listened to last week's episode have a general idea of this case and the timeline in this case. And today we're going to dive deeper into the facts and into some of the unusual aspects of this case. And we're going to talk about the possible connection to the Delphi murders. This is another one that people, I've seen a lot of people commenting on this case, people who know that we're going to cover this case because of what we said in the last episode that came out are very excited to hear it. This is a case people want to solve for obvious reasons. We have, once again, 2 young girls who were murdered brutally and viciously, and the killer is still out there. And it's not just a matter of bringing justice to these girls, though that's obviously important. It's also about preventing this from happening again. I don't think, as we've said before, that you murder 2 girls this way, and that's the last crime you ever commit. So hopefully, in talking about this case, we can shine some more light on it and maybe lead people down a path to if not solving it, at least getting the word out there. I think that's the only way you can solve a case like this. But having said that, let's dive in. Alice, you want to talk about Lyric's parents?
Absolutely. So, we often say that whenever children are missing or they've been murdered, suspicion often falls on the parents for good reason. Statistically, parents have something to do with it. They are the closest relationally to the children. And for whatever reason, parents are usually the first suspects for law enforcement. And now we're not saying that's necessarily the case here, but there is something interesting about Lyric's parents. Both had prior felony convictions for drug trafficking, and they spent 4 years in federal prison. Their names are Misty and Dan Morrissey, and they were both interviewed multiple times by police in the first weeks of the investigation. And the interview was so intense that at one point, Dan actually left the station because he felt like he was being treated like a suspect. A few things to note about, Misty and Dan Morrissey's relationship. It included domestic violence and restraining orders. It was tumultuous, to say the least. Police even complained that they'd asked for 100% cooperation from the couple, but had not received it. Immediately you think, if your child goes missing, you want to completely cooperate with the police. But I think oftentimes parents also expect maybe sympathy or empathy if they are missing a child. So if Dan here felt like he was being interrogated as a suspect, I can imagine if he had nothing to do with their murder, their disappearance, why he would be so offended.
And this happens a lot, right? When we talked about the Amy Bechtel case and how the relationship broke down with her husband because the police were acting as if he was a suspect or he might have been responsible for it. And that was basically it. I mean, he wasn't going to cooperate with them after that point. People talk about this in the Ramsey case, that the Ramseys very quickly, their relationship with the police broke down and they really didn't cooperate after that. And in this case, obviously, Misty and Dan have not had the best relationship with law enforcement before this happened. So you can imagine that they did not really trust the police anyway. And then when the police started treating them as a suspect, you can understand why that would cause them problems. But Alice is right. Police are always going to look at the parents first because that's what the statistics say. And given sort of the circumstances around them, I think it wasn't just that there was a concern they personally might have been involved. There was some concern that possibly people who they were affiliated with might have been involved.
Yeah, and that's true because at this time, Dan Morrissey was actually under indictment for drug charges, and he had been expected to plead guilty to the drug charges. Things we've told you about that come with pleading guilty. Typically, when you plead guilty, you're also agreeing to cooperate with the police. You're going to help them take down the kingpin or lead them to other people who are violating the law. So when you're pleading guilty, it can be a safe assumption for those in the community to think that you are going to cooperate in some manner with the police. One interesting to note that even though Dan had been expected to plead guilty to some drug charges, after the girls disappeared, he changed his mind for whatever reason and decided to go to trial. When he decided to go to trial, this led some people to believe that the disappearance of the girls had been a message to Dan that he'd better not cooperate with the police and that, worse things were coming, not just the disappearance of these 2 girls. While this may seem like a sexy theory, it's probably not really the case, though, because eventually Dan did not go to trial. He did plead guilty. It just took him a little bit longer to plead guilty. Ultimately, after pleading guilty, he was sentenced to a really steep sentence. He was sentenced to 90 years in prison with a 30-year mandatory minimum. Mandatory minimum meaning that the drug charges that he had been charged with were serious enough that the statute was written so that the least amount of time he could have gotten was 30 years. That's a very high minimum, as you can imagine. And he clearly got something well in excess of 30 years at 90 years, which is more than a life sentence. I'm
not entirely sure the facts of what Dan Morrissey was charged with and eventually convicted of, but I know it involved methamphetamine and methamphetamine distribution. And I know that according to some articles I read about this, apparently he continued in this distribution after the girls disappeared and was actually doing it in his home with another child present. I don't know, the judge harped on this during the sentencing, but 90 years in prison with a 30-year mandatory minimum, that's a lot. So he must have been moving some considerable amounts. Now, he says that this had nothing to do with the girl's disappearance, that there was no one who was angry at him or trying to get back at him, and this is completely unrelated. That hasn't stopped people from speculating, obviously, that it might have been some sort of message. I'll say this. Usually these days, and we've talked about this in some of our other podcasts, methamphetamine distribution is run through the Mexican mafia. And the Mexican mafia is known to be very vicious in Mexico with other gangs that they're involved with or people who oppose them. They can do some very vicious, brutal things. Not so much in the United States. I don't personally know of any circumstance where this has happened. Somebody went after somebody's kids because of, a bad drug deal or whatever. Be interested if people know of any examples of that. But while that is a sexy theory, I think it is probably unrelated to what happened. Though you can also understand why maybe the police, I think there was a thought in the police's minds that this could have been some sort of runaway or whatnot situation. Seems like with the FBI saying that the girls might have been alive as much as a week after, that maybe they were thinking that despite their young ages. And you wonder if maybe this was part of it because this was going on at the home and it was a situation where maybe the girls wanted to get away from it or something. But I think at the end of the day, this probably doesn't have anything to do with the case.
I think that's probably a good bet, Brett. We've been talking a lot about Dan, but remember, Misty was also a convicted felon, and she was actually sentenced in 2014 to a decade in prison. Now, she didn't serve that entire 10 years. She would be released after serving just a little over a year. Every state has their own rules about how much of your sentence you have to serve. Oftentimes, you can get good time credits. You can serve really just a portion, in this case, 1/10 of her sentence because of overcrowding in state prisons. So state sentences versus federal sentences have that difference. Of course, there are 50 states and a District of Columbia. They all kind of have different ways of calculating how much you actually serve. But it is not uncommon on the state side to serve kind of a small fraction of your sentence.
Yeah, I think most people would be shocked at how many crimes you can commit, particularly in states, and not really serve any time. I've always said that if I was going to commit a crime and be caught, I'd rather commit a state crime because the chances of actually going to prison are much lower. But if I had to go to prison, I'd rather commit a federal crime because the federal prisons are much nicer. So, it's a trade-off because in the federal system, they have what they call truth in sentencing laws. So that essentially whatever you get from the judge with some minor adjustments for behavior and other things is what you're going to serve. There's no parole in the federal system. So if you get 10 years, you're basically going to serve 10 years. Obviously, in Iowa, Misty received a sentence of 10 years and served a little over a year. I don't know if that was because of parole or because of something else that was going on, but it is kind of wild, the huge variations in the sentences people can receive and the amount of time they will actually serve. And anytime you see a case where you're like, how was that guy free when he was convicted of X or Y? It's probably because he was convicted in state court. And even though he probably got a hefty sentence, he was never going to serve all that time because, like Alice said, prisons are overcrowded, budgets are tight, and just a lot of times people are not. It's kind of funny because on the one hand, a lot of people who you think should be in jail for a lot longer are released. You don't really understand why. And then on the other hand, it seems like there's all these people who are in jail who probably shouldn't be in jail. I don't know.
And that's actually a really good point, Brett. As we're recording right now, I know this is going to be about 2 weeks later for you guys listening, but this happens on the bond side of things, so pre-conviction as well. Right now, unraveling in Houston is this murderer who has a tiger, and apparently his tiger got loose, and he, was able to get the tiger, throw it into his car, and jet off, and apparently he's not just a holder of tigers in his house and I think other wild animals. He also was out on bond for murder, and a lot of people I saw on Twitter were asking if he is or if he's charged with murder, homicide, how can he be out of jail? And that's part of the issue too, is that prisons, jails, all of them are overcrowded. So often people, even charged with serious crimes like homicide, if they make bond, can get out pending trial or an ultimate plea of guilty.
Yeah, who knew Tiger King was going to have a sequel, right? some enterprising producer right now is furiously emailing Netflix.
I can't wait to find out more about what's going on after we finish recording, because it's wild.
I know. I saw that video.
It's wild.
Crazy. It is literally wild.
Anyways, totally off tangent. But this is all to say that Lyric's parents were convicted felons, and they were convicted of drug charges. And so I don't think it's irrelevant to talk about it here in case there were people who may have wanted to send a message to them. And we often know, like Brett said, the cartels and people with power and intimidation often go for your most vulnerable spot, which is often your family, your children.
Now, I do think if the cartels were involved, the bodies would not have been found in a wilderness area by accident. They would have sent a message. I mean, that's usually what they do. If you look at some of the things the cartels in Mexico do, I mean, they are just unbelievably brutal and vicious, and people don't tend to just disappear. They show up often in multiple places, and yeah, it doesn't fit that. It just doesn't fit that MO. And people have speculated about this with Delphi as well, that maybe it was a similar thing there, and I just don't see it. I think in the grand scheme of things, it is much more likely this is just some random killer than it's a cartel sending a message. I mean, that's just not something that happens in real life. One thing that we have talked about before, and we're going to have the opportunity to talk about some concrete examples of in this case, are false confessions. I do not understand why people do this. I'll never understand why people do this, but they do. And false confessions actually aren't even that rare. And in fact, false confessions, we're not just talking somebody gets taken in for an interview and really gets hammered and then confesses to a crime they didn't commit. We're talking about people who just show up at the police station and say, I committed this crime. I'm the guy you're looking for. This is one of the reasons, as we've said before, you have holdback evidence, because you essentially sit the guy down and you say, well, how'd you kill him? And they say, well, I shot him in the back of the head and they were stabbed to death. And so the guy's lying. This is actually, those of you who are fans of Making a Murderer, one of the issues in that case, if you've ever watched the interrogation video of Brendan Dassey, at one point the police are asking, how'd he do it? How was she killed? And he never answers. And finally one of the cops says, I'll just ask you, which one of you shot her? Right? And it's like, well, you just gave it away, and then he says, oh, that was Stephen, right? And a lot of people think that's a big example of the police falling down in that case and giving information to the person they're interrogating that they should be holding back. Now, my understanding is he had actually said in the unrecorded version of that interrogation that Avery had shot her, and this was them getting it on tape. Different case. We can talk about that later. But nonetheless, that's what you see. You see people coming in, they're confessing, they are claiming to have knowledge, but you know more as the police because you haven't released all the information and you're able to weed those people out. And we had that in this case. In fact, at least two different people, have confessed to brutally murdering these young girls. Once again, we're not psychologists. There's some great women in crime. Maybe they have an answer for why people do something like this, but in these cases, the police brought these people in, they interrogated them, and they were able to eliminate them as suspects using that holdback information that we have talked about before.
And Brett, I know we've often harped on holdback evidence being a negative because it frustrates, the public's ability to understand or help solve a crime. But here we see the purpose of holdback evidence. And in most cases, this is how holdback evidence works.
Right. And this is exactly why they keep it back. Sometimes, as we've said in other cases, we think they keep too much back, particularly when it could be useful in finding out who the killer is. But there's a reason it's not just an open file where the public knows everything. The police know. This case, in addition to having these two people who falsely confessed, it's strange. Sometimes it just feels like tragedy builds on tragedy, like tragedy attracts more tragedy. And you had that definitely in this case. There was a woman named Teresa Gerlman. And in a strange and really tragic twist of this case, this is a lady from Belle Plaine, Iowa, and she told police that she had information about the Evansdale murders. Obviously, that was information the police wanted to hear, but before she delivered it to them, she took her 8-year-old son and stepped in front of a train, killing them both. The police executed a search warrant on her home, but as far as we know at this time, they found no indication that she had actual information about Evansdale. My understanding is that Teresa had struggled with a lot of mental illness up to this point, and it is likely that she didn't know anything about these two girls, and this was just part of this sort of break with reality that she was having that led to her killing herself and her son.
Another person who is a potential suspect in the Evansdale murders is Michael James Clunder. On May 20th, 2013, Clunder kidnapped 15-year-old Kathleen Shepard and 12-year-old Desi Hughes, so 2 young girls. Clunder was a convicted sex offender, having spent a large portion of his life in prison. And he started his offenses at the age of 15 after he assaulted a girl in a bathroom before he pistol whipped her. That girl spent a week in a hospital, so this was a very serious beating that he inflicted upon her. And at the age of 15, Clunder went to juvenile hall. When he was 17, he choked a coworker and again ended up in jail. This is a pretty violent record, all before the age of 18, and it didn't stop once he turned 18. Oftentimes we will see a pretty heavy juvenile record, and then it kind of takes 2 paths. Sometimes people really honestly kind of grow out of it. I'm not saying the minute they turn 18, but we will see as they go into their 20s, the offenses, typically they're not this serious, I should say. They're usually pettier offenses. They peter out as essentially people mature. But we also unfortunately see those who take the other path, which is that the crimes get more and more egregious and dangerous. And that is the path Clunder took. After he turned 18, he was convicted of 5 different kidnapping and assault felonies. And this was all before the day in May 2013 when these girls disappeared.
And let me just say, I am all for reforms to the way we do sentencing and prisons and all that stuff. But there are some people who just need to go to jail and never get out of jail. And this is one of them. You know, Michael James Clunder, it should have become obvious to somebody before 2013, when he was in his 40s, when he had spent 80% of his adult life in prison for assaulting, sexually assaulting, kidnapping, abusing, beating people, that he just needed to go to jail forever and never get out. And it's just unfortunate, as we said earlier, that there are these people who are sitting in jail who shouldn't be, and have really long sentences for crimes that don't seem that serious. And then you have people like Michael James Clunder, who committed these incredibly serious crimes, really hurt people, and yet was walking free and able to commit this crime that we're going to talk about. And I don't know what to do about it, but as we said earlier, this is just another example that you can be convicted of some pretty serious crimes, depending on where you are, and not spend a lot of time in jail for it.
Now let's talk a little bit about those 2 girls, Kathleen, Desi, and what he did to them, because I think it will show you why Clunder became a prime suspect in the Evansdale murders. So Clunder offered these 2 girls, who were from Dayton, Iowa, a ride, saying that they could make some money mowing lawns. Unfortunately, this is classic, right? Classic, don't take candy from strangers, don't get into strangers' cars. And unfortunately, they accepted his offer. And they got in his car. He drove them around for hours, and eventually he drove them to a secluded area. He took Kathleen into the woods and left Desi locked in the truck. Desi managed to escape, and she fled into the forest, finding help in a nearby home. The police were notified, and when they reached the truck, they found Clunder was in the truck dead, and Kathleen was nowhere to be seen. Unfortunately, Kathleen didn't get away. Her body was later found in the Des Moines River, stabbed and beaten to death.
And obviously, you know, if Desi doesn't run, she's going to be dead too. I think one thing to point out here, some people have said the same thing we talked about Delphi a couple weeks ago. We talked about the suspect who's still a suspect at this time. Who knows if he still will be by the time you guys listen to this. But people compared the crimes and said one of them's really dumb and one of them's not. And so could it really be the same person who did it? And you might think to yourself, really dumb of him just to leave the girl locked in the truck. I mean, of course she's going to run. But that's not necessarily true. A lot of people freeze in situations like that. They think if they just cooperate and just do what they're told, the person will let them go. Desi obviously didn't make that mistake and she fled, but these girls are also a little bit older than the girls from Evansdale, 15 and 12, whereas the girls from Evansdale were 10 and 8. I think Elizabeth was about to turn 9, but very young. So you can imagine maybe they were a little bit more compliant than these girls were.
What we know about Clunder was that he was a convicted sex offender who lived in the area. He was 42 years old and worked on a nearby hog farm. Remember what we said in the Delphi episodes when we were trying to build the profile of Bridge Guy? We said that this was someone likely comfortable with killing, comfortable with his hands because of the ease with which he moved and was able to commit these 2 murders in a short span of time. Here, Clunder kind of fits that profile. He works with his hands, he is outdoors, he is able to manipulate these large hogs. Hogs are, I don't know if you've ever worked around them, but they are large animals. He had a weapon with them, basically a gun that fires a bolt that's used to slaughter hogs. So he was familiar with killing on a regular basis. Let's make clear again, because I'm sure we'll get someone who's angry about it. We're not saying all farmers or anyone who slaughters animals for a living has a propensity to be a murderer. Not at all. We're saying that whoever committed these murders, and Clunder, was comfortable with killing. And that is the case for Clunder. He absolutely fits the profile we were building in Delphi. And the profile really of what we're talking about here in Evansdale as well.
And I just want to say to all those people who are upset at us for the way we described that profile, Clunder obviously didn't commit the Delphi murders because he was dead by then, but he fits the profile to a T that we described. I mean, he is exactly what you're looking for. Someone who lives in the area, who's familiar with the area, somebody who's comfortable with his hands, somebody who's comfortable with killing. And here he is, doing that to these girls. And like Alice said, we're not saying that just because you work in that industry or because you're good with your hands that you're a murderer. That's not what we're saying at all. In fact, it might be the opposite of that. He fits that profile, and I still think the Delphi killer, if they're ever found, will also fit that profile. Unfortunately, I mean, Clunder, he's such a good suspect. It's too bad that he obviously is not the person who committed that crime, and it seems like he's not the person who committed this crime either.
Despite the fact that Clunder would appear to be a very good suspect here in these Evansdale murders, police are actually extremely confident that Clunder is not the killer. Now, this is disappointing because he just seems to fit the profile so well. The police, they have a number of reasons that they were probably able to reach their conclusion that he's not the killer. But it might be that they knew exactly where Clunder was the day of the murder. Maybe he has an airtight alibi. In fact, this was the stated reason of what they said. They didn't say what exactly it was, but maybe they were able to track a credit card statement or spot him somewhere on CC camera, something more than just his own alibi. Of course, it's always possible that they were able to use DNA to rule him out.
Yeah, we just don't know. They've kept all that information close hold that they might have, as we've discussed before. They were very vague. I mean, they claim they're very confident it's not him. They're very vague about why. They've indicated they know where he was. Alibi is always weak. We talked about this before. There's a lot of people who just are not satisfied with that because he's such a good suspect. They'd like more, which leads me to believe they probably do have more. They probably do have some DNA or something where they're able to definitively rule him out, because they have been pretty definitive in ruling him out. I'm sure there's people who are listening to this who disagree with that. I'd love to hear your thoughts on why you may agree or disagree with them ruling him out. Now, we talked about Dayton, Iowa. That's about 100 miles away from Evansdale, so not incredibly far away, but also not, right down the road either. I would remind you that where the girls were found, very isolated, the kind of place you would expect only someone who really knew the area well would know about. It's not clear if Clunder fits that description or not. He's from Iowa. He's from close by, but maybe not as close by as you would like if you were really going to point to him as a viable suspect. Another suspect that people have pointed to is Jeff Altmaier. Now, normally we don't talk too much about suspects, but we thought these were interesting for a few reasons because they point out some things. You can talk about Klunder. Klunder really sort of, like you said, he fits a profile. It's really interesting to think about the fact that he's involved in the double murder of 2 girls, which means, if you're keeping score, we've talked about Delphi before, which is the double murder of 2 girls. We're now talking about Evansdale, which is the double murder of 2 girls. Michael Klunder attempted to kill 2 girls. He killed one of them. We've said before, double murders are pretty rare. And that's why it's kind of crazy when you think about these cases and how similar they are, and the fact that you've got at least 3 of these instances in a pretty close period of time, in a pretty close states, which has led a lot of people to think that there may be a connection between Evansdale and Delphi. We're going to talk about that in a minute. As far as Jeff Altmaier, he's just another example that there are a lot of these people out there. And that's one of the reasons it's hard to figure out who does this, because there's always a lot of suspects in cases like this. Altmaier is a pedophile who was arrested in 2016 after he, much like Klunder, attempted to lure a girl into his car, claiming that he was an undercover police officer. This is always a popular theory in the Delphi case, that the murderer actually told the girls that he was a police officer, and that was how he was able to gain control of them. You could imagine the same thing in Evansdale. The girls are riding their bikes near the lake. The person pulls up in this SUV-looking vehicle we talked about earlier, either a Suburban or a Bronco. Maybe he claims to be an undercover police officer. Kids listen to police. You're sort of trained to trust the police, right? It's a very good way to get control of people. The girl, though, either she sensed something was wrong or she had just been taught not to buy into that stuff. So she told her parents, and it's actually interesting, Altmaier was not able to get out of the neighborhood before some adults got together and tracked him down and stopped him. And Altmaier, he tried to even use the whole "I'm an undercover police officer" on the adults, and obviously that was not going to work. And Altmaier was arrested, and the police realized that he was, in fact, a serial molester. He had abused, or attempted to abuse, at least 19 girls, age 8 to 13, all across Iowa. He had a job that required him to sort of drive around the area, and essentially he would visit places, do his job, and then try to run this scam on girls. Altmaier, he was an insurance adjuster, which is why he was traveling around. He would evaluate car accidents, determine whether or not the car was totaled, how much the damage was worth, etc. He is certainly considered a suspect in this case, but we don't really have anything definitive that ever tied him to Evansdale. Obviously, one big difference, we don't know of any cases in which he killed anyone. Now, you might think, well, maybe Evansdale was the culmination of that, but remember, he wasn't arrested until 2016. You would think if he had graduated to murdering people, that he would have continued on that path, and it seems like he did not do that. Nevertheless, because of his traveling around Iowa, because he has targeted young girls before, he's certainly a suspect, but at least at this time, the police have not said that there's anything definitive tying him to the Evansdale murders.
What we do have, though, is that the FBI conducted a behavioral analysis on who they believe this suspect is. And we had gone through this in some of our other cases as well. This is what FBI does, right? This is their forte in doing behavioral analysis. So I find what they have put together incredibly interesting. So listen closely, because we've noted for you some possible suspects, but though the profile may fit, those actual people are likely not the perpetrators in these murders. But they have a lot of qualities that the FBI behavioral analysis thinks that the perpetrator does have. First, the offender is familiar with both Myers Lake and Seven Bridges Wildlife Area in Bremer County. This is just like Delphi. This is someone who the FBI believes is familiar with the area. They were hunting in the grounds that they felt very comfortable in. We talked about Seven Bridges Wildlife Area last time, how it truly was a miracle that these hunters stumbled upon the girls' bodies. It is very possible that those girls never would have been found if by chance these hunters didn't stumble upon them, because it is just so dense and so wild.
I sometimes think that if hunting ever falls out of favor altogether, that a lot more murderers will get away, because it seems like it's always a hunter who finds the body whenever it's, left somewhere like this.
Which actually makes a lot of sense, right? Because hunters need to go where the ground is not tread often, because animals are smart. If it's a well-trafficked area, you don't often see wild animals because they know that's the well-trafficked area. Most wild animals are not looking to hunt. They're actually trying to stay in the background. And so if you are going hunting, you have to go to places that no one goes, because that is where the animals are in their element. That's where they let their guards down and can be hunted. So that says a lot about where these girls were dumped. They were dumped not in a high trafficked area. None of Seven Bridges wildlife area is well trafficked, but they were certainly dumped in an area that was known to be very remote. The offender selected Seven Bridges because he was familiar with just how secluded that area is. We'd already said that he probably thought these girls would never be found, or he'd have a lot more time than he actually had before their bodies were discovered. I think that someone not familiar with this area would not have known exactly where to dump them, or would have gotten lost in the process of dumping them. Because like we said, it was so wild that unlikely he was able to drive a car all the way back there. Someone probably would have seen it's not paved back there. So he probably had to park some distance away. It would have taken time, and he would have needed cover of a completely secluded area. Another reason that the FBI believes this offender has not been found is that he blends in with, and actually may be part of, the Evansdale, Bremer surrounding communities. This is your neighbor, right? This is someone who is not an obvious suspect around you. Just maybe that quiet neighbor who lives down the street and really keeps to himself. The perpetrator most likely used something like quiet coercion to gain compliance, such as a ruse or threats of violence to get the girls to leave with him. So they don't believe this was some big affair where, the girls were screaming and he grabbed one and he grabbed the other girl and was pulling them by the hair and there was a lot of fight. They think that he was able to get away with this while they were on their bikes because he was able to use kind of this persuasive power that he had to persuade these girls to maybe get close enough where he could gain control over them.
And I want to focus on Evansdale, but I can't help but keep coming back to Delphi, as we've talked about a lot with this case. The things that Alice is going through, I realize the FBI did this behavioral analysis for this case. They've never released what they did for Delphi. Most of it's going to look exactly like this. I mean, the things that you're looking for in the person who committed this crime is what you're going to be looking for in Delphi, and this whole quiet coercion thing. Just the way in the Delphi case that he gained control over the girls. I mean, some people might think he might have flashed a gun or a knife, but it certainly was a very controlled thing that he did. The whole guy's down the hill, the way he says it, the quiet command that he has. Similar thing here. This person would have approached these girls and he would have immediately asserted dominance over them in such a way that they would have felt as if they had no choice but to comply with whatever he was telling them to do.
Now, during July of 2012, the perpetrator may have been experiencing stress due to spousal problems, financial difficulties, legal trouble with a variety of things, employment difficulties, or mental health issues. This is what the FBI thinks, and that may be what led him to commit these crimes at this time.
Right, and I think that's the thing, right? Like, why did he do it that day? People focus on all sorts of things. I mean, people focus on the date, and it was a Monday or what, I can't remember exactly what day it was, but the day of the week. And they even do that when they're trying to connect this to Delphi. It's the same date, maybe, but more likely, whoever did this, there is something going on in their life that is stressing them out and sort of triggers them, and they go out and commit this crime. And that's why they do it then, right? It's not an excuse. They can't point to that and say, well, I only killed him because, my wife was cheating on me or whatever. It's not that. It's just there's somebody who wants to kill people, who wants to do harm. They're obviously not doing that every single day of their lives. Why this day? It might have been something like this. And when you're talking about this profile, this is really a roadmap to people who know this person to help them identify him as a suspect. So as we're talking about this and you're thinking about this, if there's someone in your life who was in this area at the time and you can match these factors, that's the kind of person you should consider maybe phoning in a tip about.
Right. The FBI further goes on to say that the offender may avoid discussing the case, but kind of strangely, they may also show a lot of interest in following the media developments. This is kind of based on their litany of cases that they know from experience, but we said this before where the offenders sometimes like to relive their glory of committing these murders by following media developments. But maybe he also is savvy enough. He hasn't been caught so far, so he's savvy enough to know that if he talks about it too much, he may slip up. He may say something that's inconsistent, that it could make others begin to suspect his story or what he has to say if his story changes over time. So he's smart enough not to discuss it openly, but at the same time, he shows a lot of interest in what's happening in the case, who's discussing it. You know, we've talked about this in the past where cold cases have been solved, and when someone's been arrested, they have found out that the perpetrator, the arrested person, had actually been Patreons for podcasts that covered his case. There's kind of this glory seeking, even if it's not outward facing.
And yeah, this is one that may seem a little weird because it's like, well, if he follows the case, he might have done it. Or if he didn't follow the case, he might have done it. You might think, well, that's not very helpful. But I think Alice is right. It's really, if it seems weird either way, like, they just never want to talk about it. Anytime somebody brings it up, they don't want to talk about it. Well, that's kind of weird, right? Because it doesn't involve them. Or if they're really obsessed with it. Or if they're obsessed with it, but they try and hide how obsessed they are. How obsessed they are with it. That's sort of what you're looking for.
Right, absolutely. Following the disappearance, the FBI thinks that the suspect may have changed their appearance, hairstyle, or facial hair. Maybe something that doesn't seem that obvious upon first glance, but when you start putting the pieces together, maybe you know of someone who, got a divorce in July of 2012, and then they used to have a beard and then shaved it off, or vice versa. They had no beard and started growing out into a mountain man sort of beard. Standing alone may not mean enough, but when you start pairing it with these other personality factors, it might trigger your thoughts of something you may know that you didn't think was connected to this until you hear this behavioral analysis. There is a car involved in this case. We know that because they were too far away and they left too quickly and their bikes were left behind. So the FBI believe that the vehicle may have been hidden or suddenly sold, this car that was used in the commission of this murder and kidnapping. Or it maybe was altered with a new paint job to try and disguise it. It's also possible that the interior was reupholstered. This one probably isn't to change the appearance of the car, but rather if anything happened inside the car, the perpetrator may have been trying to get rid of DNA evidence of the girls being in his car, whether it was just stray hairs or if the murder happened inside the car or maybe sexual assault happened inside the car, there would be DNA left behind. So the reupholstering could be trying to get rid of that DNA should the police ever get their hands on the car.
So those are some things to look for if you're trying to think about whether or not someone may or may not be involved in this case or in the Delphi case. Multiple times we've mentioned Delphi. Like I said, you can't talk about Evansdale without talking about Delphi. And there are some reasons for that. There are similarities between these two cases. We're going to go through those similarities and we're going to go through the differences. And you can decide for yourself whether or not they're related. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, right? If we can find the person who did Evansdale, if they were the person who committed the Delphi murders, great. If not, well, we found the guy who killed the Evansdale girls. So I hope all of you are thinking critically about that to try and find this person, regardless of whether or not they're related to Delphi. Even if it turns out that this guy that was arrested recently for a different crime is the Delphi murderer, doesn't mean we need to stop looking for this guy. So let's keep our focus on it. So what are some similarities between these two crimes? First, obviously, both involve two young girls. We've said this before. This is pretty rare. It's rare to have someone who targets two different individuals with one crime and gets away with it, frankly. I mean, we talked about Michael James Clunder earlier. He targeted two girls. He didn't get away with it. And one of the reasons he didn't get away with it is it's hard. It's hard to control two people and to commit a crime against two people. And he sort of shows how difficult that can be. So whoever did this got away with it in both cases. Doesn't necessarily mean they're related, but as we've said before, pretty rare, makes you think. Both abductions took place in the middle of the day. This is another sort of unusual thing. This is something where someone in the middle of the day decided to kidnap not one, but two people. They both took place on a day that the killer would have known that kids were out of school and would be out and about. In the case of the Evansdale Girls, it was the middle of summer. In the case of Delphi, it was a in-service day for teachers, so the girls were off. Both abductions took place at a park. So, some really weird things here, right? Like a park, a public place, where there might have been other people, particularly on a day when all the kids are out, done in the middle of the day, going after two girls. Those are some pretty strong things that tie the cases together. In both cases, police have refused to release the cause of death, which makes you think there must be or maybe something about the cause of death that will be helpful in identifying this killer or convicting them eventually. Makes you think it might be something a little unique, or maybe a unique weapon. It's hard to say. In both cases, the area where the bodies were left was isolated and rarely traveled, and only someone familiar with the area would have known about the location. Now, this is sort of a double-edged sword because on the one hand, it's a similarity, but it also contains its own problem. Would this person have known about both the isolated area in Evansdale and the isolated area in Delphi? If it were somebody who did their homework, or if it were someone who traveled around a lot and maybe spent some amount of time in different places and had an opportunity to learn the layout of those places, then maybe. But in any event, this person seems to have, if these two crimes were committed, they have a very similar MO. Kidnapping two girls in the middle of the day in a park and then leaving their bodies in an isolated area where only someone who knew that area would have been able to leave the bodies. And this one I think is less significant, but nevertheless is a connection. In both cases, the parents of at least one of the girls were alleged to be involved in some way or the other with the drug trade.
So those are a lot of similarities, Brett, but as similar as they are, there are obvious differences between the cases as well. In Delphi, the girls were killed where they were found. Now, as we discussed in our Delphi episodes, it's possible that this was not actually the plan of the killer, that maybe the killer had not planned to kill them right after they had crossed the creek. Maybe he was actually trying to get them back to a car and take them away, but for some reason maybe they fought, so he had to kill them there. We know in this case that the girls were taken from the park and not discovered until much later and much further away. Delphi, the girls were found right away because they were close to where they were taken. Here, there was a lag. They were miles apart.
And remember, the FBI was saying a week after these girls disappeared that they thought they might still be alive. If there had been evidence that the murder had been committed there, like imagine he finds the girls, he kills them at the park, and then he takes their bodies away. You would assume, as we've often said, crimes are messy, that there would have been evidence of their death there. So it seems pretty clear that in the Evansdale case, he did take these girls alive, away from where he found them, kind of like Michael Klunder, and then took them off to some secluded area.
Right. And now we just read to you the FBI behavioral analysis, the profile of who they think the killer is. So what that means is the police in the Evansdale murders have released a profile of the killer. No such thing has happened in the Delphi cases. We have told you time and time again that the Delphi law enforcement surrounding that case have been very tight-lipped about everything about the case, including the profile about the killer.
And you might think, well, that's not really a difference, but it might be. This is sort of speculation. But why haven't they released it in Delphi? We know they've done one. I don't know if they've ever said they've done one, but they absolutely have. The FBI is involved in the Delphi case. It's a double murder of children. This is the bread and butter of the behavioral sciences unit. They have absolutely done a profile of the Delphi murder, and it makes you wonder, is there something about the profile that they don't want to release?
Right. It could also be that the police in Delphi have a suspect in mind, and they don't need the behavioral analysis because they don't need people to remember what happened in, July of 2012 and then someone changed their appearance. Maybe they already have a pretty good idea of who it is, and they don't really need amateur sleuths. They just need a way to get the person they think it is. Whereas maybe in Evansdale, the reason they're releasing such a detailed profile is because they don't have many leads and they need the public. They need people to bring suspects to them. That's a complete speculation, but it's possible. Why else would you be essentially putting out a blueprint for a killer in one case, and in a very similar case, not putting out a blueprint whatsoever.
And that's a really interesting idea. It actually answers a lot of questions in the Delphi case about why the police have done some of the things they've done, if that were true. Why are they not releasing more information? Why are they not releasing more video? Why are they not releasing more audio? If it's true that they have a suspect they feel strongly about, and then we're wrong. What we've been telling you this whole time is that we just need to find this guy, and if we find him, we'll be able to convict him. It's not actually true. The police may know who it is. That may seem crazy to you. You might be thinking, well, if they know who it is, why don't they arrest them? Well, the problem is there's a big difference between knowing who did it and having the evidence to convict them. We have no idea, total speculation, but if it were true, then you would imagine a situation where the Delphi police are just waiting for this guy to slip up, for something to turn up that ties him more tightly to the crime. And as Alice said, that would be an explanation for why you would not necessarily release that behavioral report.
This may not seem like a huge difference, but there is a difference in the girls' ages. The Evansdale girls were younger. They were 10 and 8 years old. And the Delphi girls, Abby and Libby, they were 13 and 14. Now that might seem, just about 4 to 6 years difference. But remember, Abby and Libby, we had said this, were, at least the case with Libby, she was the weight and height of an adult. And that makes a difference in how you're able to gain control of, larger people, larger masses to gain control over, to get them to follow your instruction, go with you somewhere. Whereas in this case, if you look at Lyric and you look at Elizabeth, they look like little children. It's possible that they would be somewhat easier to control physically than Abby and Libby.
And I hate to even talk about this, but the fact of the matter is these people, they have a target that they're going after, and it's usually a look, and an age is going to be part of it. I mean, we've dealt with child pornography cases before. They're all terrible and awful, but it's just a fact that there are people who in their particular sickness are focused on a particular type of person. So it actually is a pretty big deal that you have an 8 and a 10-year-old versus a 13 and 14-year-old.
Right. I mean, what Brett is saying here essentially is one set are prepubescent girls and the other set are post-puberty girls. And those are actually, as disturbing as it may sound, there are subsets of those who are into pedophilia of either prepubescent or post-puberty children. And what we're saying is that these two sets of girls fall into different categories. It doesn't mean that pedophiles or those who are into child pornography are not into both categories, but you do see that there are categories in which these people fall into typically. There are actually a lot more similarities than there are differences, but I do think, at least with respect, I don't know, Brett, what do you think? Do you think it is the same perpetrator between Delphi and Evansdale?
No, I don't. At the end of the day, I don't think it is. I realize there are a lot of connections, and I realize, we've said again and again how rare these things are, but I wish they were more rare, I guess would be my sort of closing on this. They're not as rare as they should be. And I don't think they're related. And the reason I don't think they are related is until I am given a perpetrator who would have been as familiar with Delphi as they would be with Evansdale, it's hard for me to imagine the same person committing this crime. And what I mean by that is the key to this is that this person was very familiar with the area, knew where they were, and used that knowledge to both gain control of the girls and to be able to commit these crimes and cover these crimes up without being found. That's, one of the main things about this. Where the girls were found in Evansdale, very isolated. Where the girls were found in Delphi, very isolated. And maybe it wasn't so much that the area they were found was isolated, but the area where the guy was hunting for them was just not a place that people would know unless they had been to Delphi. Now, for those of you who don't know, a lot of people sort of think of the Midwest as just one big blob, right? So if you're familiar with Evansdale, you're probably familiar with Delphi. It's about 400 miles from Evansdale to Delphi, so it's not exactly close. It's not like, you're just jaunting over to Delphi to check out the Rails to Trails park on the weekend if you live in Evansdale. So to me, I don't think they're connected. I kind of hope they are. which may sound weird, but it would be nice if finding one of the people who committed one of these crimes resulted in finding the other one.
Brett, I agree with you. As much as I'd like these two murders to be connected in some way, that it's the same perpetrator, so that if we solve one, we can solve the other, I don't think that they are in fact the same perpetrator for a lot of the same reasons you have already noted. The biggest thing here is that these are both small towns, and they have areas that are not known to even people who live in those areas. So yes, it's possible that a trucker who often drives this 400-mile stretch just happens to know the Monon High Bridge and this wildlife area and this lake, Myers Lake. But the way these crimes are committed, unfortunately, the profile I read to you guys is a common profile. You know why the FBI is able to come up with this profile? Because they've seen this so many times before. These local, usually men, who are very familiar and who kind of just reside below the radar enough that they don't really cause any ripples in their town. They kind of exist in the town. They kind of blend in, but they are looking to strike. And when they do, they have been below the radar for so long that it is not easy to detect them, as is the case, I think, both in Evansdale and Delphi. So I think the fact that these cases are so similar actually goes to the fact that the profile that we have read to you is unfortunately more common than not in these types of perpetrators. And maybe we'll be totally proven wrong, and I would be so happy about that. But I think that's why we wanted to focus on the Evansdale murders, Lyric and Elizabeth, because their case, if more attention is paid to them because of the Delphi murders, wonderful. But I think people need to make sure to listen to the profile of their killer and to know the facts of this case, because I don't think that this perpetrator is the same as in the Delphi case.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. It's probably an interesting question for somebody to answer who's more knowledgeable than I am. It's weird. Why is Delphi so famous? And there's so much focus on Delphi. And then Evansdale gets kind of forgotten. And honestly, most people, when they talk about Evansdale, and even we did this, we tried to avoid this, and we still did it. They talk about Evansdale through the lens of Delphi. I'm not sure what the answer is. Both these girls, both their families, they all deserve justice, and their killer should be found, both to give them justice and to prevent them from acting again. And I truly believe one way these two cases are definitely connected is somebody out there has some information and they can solve this case. The FBI gave you a roadmap. The FBI laid it out for you. Like, this is the profile. This is who we're looking for. This is what was going on in their life at the time. Think about that. You may know this person. As disturbing as that is to say, you may know this person. You may hold the key. And hopefully we can figure this one out.
So if you think you do have information, you are encouraged to call the Evansdale Police Tip Line. Their number is 319-232-6682. Again, that's 319-232-6682. Or you can call the Cedar Valley Crime Stoppers at 855-300-8477. That's Cedar Valley Crime Stoppers at 855-300-8477.
And there's also an email address, ourmissingiowa@dps.state.ia.us, and we will put all this information on the website. If you're watching this on YouTube now, you're looking at it. If you have information, if you even have the inkling of information, if you even think there might be a possibility, and you're dismissing it in the back of your head, oh, that's ridiculous. There's no way he could be involved. Let the police make that decision. Let them know.
And the other thing is, we saw from the Delphi case, we got a lot of people who wanted to run their tips by us first because they were like, is it stupid? Am I just overthinking things? If you feel more comfortable, emailing us first, go for it. We're happy to talk to you. Really, if you think you have something that's worth emailing us, it's probably worth calling into the police and tip lines. But we are here for you as well, since we want these cases solved for these girls, for their families, for the communities as well. These communities are now defined by these horrific murders of these young, innocent girls. And we hope, if anything, you know a little bit more about this case. You point your friends to it and you continue to follow it. Maybe you don't know something, but maybe someone you introduce this case to will know something. And like Brett said, the main similarity between these two cases is someone knows something, and we might just be one good tip away from stopping this killer from doing it again.
Well, we hope you guys have enjoyed this investigation of the Evansdale murders. If you have thoughts, questions, or comments, feel free to email us at prosecutorspod@gmail.com, at prosecutorspod for Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. That's the other one, Facebook. Come hang out on the gallery on Facebook. We're always hanging around there answering questions. You can look us up on Reddit, talk to us on YouTube, join our Patreon. We're everywhere. By the time you hear this, we'll only be, what, Alice? A couple weeks? 10 days? Something like that from CrimeCon. So
Whoa.
We are so excited to see you guys there. We are on track to be there. Look us up. Don't leave us sitting there alone while everybody's hanging out at the True Crime Garage table or whatnot. Like, we don't want to look like a bunch of losers. So you got to take pity on us. Come talk to us for at least a few minutes. We're really excited about it. Really excited to see you. Shoot us an email if you're going. Let us know you're going to be there. Well, Alice, I think that's all we have for tonight. Is there anything else you want to share?
No, thank you guys for listening, and let's bring justice for these girls and for this community.
Absolutely. And we will be back next week with a new case. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. I don't know what we do on TikTok.
What do other podcasts do on TikTok?
I've never watched a TikTok that wasn't
You've
like one
probably
of these viral
watched TikTok,
TikToks.
you just don't know it. I've never watched TikTok on TikTok, if that makes
Well,
sense.
I've watched the viral TikTok.
Yeah,
a
that
lot.
I've seen
the guy
those.
skateboarding with a T or whatever. But I've never watched like a true crime TikTok. Maybe we'll ask our fans if we need a TikTok. Can't you only record like a minute on TikTok? or
Yeah,
something?
it's like very short, right?
Yeah. I mean, we can barely do anything in a short period of time. What we can do with TikTok? TikTok and Scott Peterson. We did it.
Motherly just sounds so maternal. Not as bad as the person who called us middle-aged.
Yeah.
How do they know
that
we're
was a great
middle-aged?
review, but we're not middle-aged.
We're not middle-aged, but also, like, why would they call us that? Like, when is middle-age ever a compliment?
I guess when you're like 70.